I have been a really big fan of walking. I noticed the impacts it was having on my body and on my blood work a couple years ago when I was doing a transformation. But what really kicked my interest in it was trying to understand why these subsistence populations aren't getting the same diseases that we do. So I got really interested in going into like all the aspects of their lifestyle. And one thing that I noticed that was incredibly consistent was how much they all walked. Even if you look at populations like the Amish in the United States, they are walking 18,000 steps. They have a lot less incidence of heart disease. They have a lot less incidence rates of hypertension, and then a lot fewer incidence rates of type 2 diabetes. And this is despite eating a diet that we wouldn't necessarily consider optimal. They're having 1 to 2 servings of cake or baked goods per day. It's like 1.5 servings of vegetables per day. Their diet's very high in saturated fat, but despite that, they have a lot of better outcomes. So that's what really got me interested in it. A month and a half ago, I really started to try to understand why, and going into all of the mechanisms that in the body that would account for that. And what I found was that I personally think that it can be difficult to replace walking. Now, one area where I would agree is, I don't think walking is enough. I do think that you should resistance train. I do think that you should, do some higher intensity, aerobic effort. But I do also think that there are a few substitutes for that walking base. And we can go into a couple of reasons why, but probably one of the biggest things is lipid clearance. So, when we walk, we're going to clear the things, that we ate. One of those things is glucose. And so one of my favorite studies was a study that they did on type 2 diabetics, and they were comparing what happens if you go for a walk after a meal versus metformin versus both. And what was so interesting to me about that study is walking alone outperformed metformin alone in type 2 diabetics. So they were doing a 50-minute walk in this case after they ate, and that 50-minute walk resulted in less glucose, they call it area under the curve, than metformin alone. So powerful. That is just incredibly powerful, I think. But it's not just glucose; it's actually lipids as well. And so when we walk, it's going to activate things like our LDLR, which is a receptor that will clear our lipids. So that is kind of one area where it's a little bit difficult to substitute higher intensity, just because it's activated more on frequency than it is intensity. So if you went out and did a whole bunch of high intensity, it would probably be better in that case to do a little bit lower intensity through the day. So the other thing that it is really good at is our endothelial health and our arterial stiffness. As early as like 2011, the general consensus was that there's no way to avoid our arteries getting stiffer as we aged. I found this 2011 guidance, and right in there in the first paragraph, they said that it's kind of an inevitable part of aging. And when you get stiff arteries, there are all sorts of diseases that can occur from that being the case. Over the years, though, they've started to notice this new phenotype, and they call it supernova. And so it's these people that have seemed to avoid this arterial stiffness. And in this it was in the Framingham study where they identified it in a population, but about 20% of the population was the supernova phenotype. But I think that was released in 2021, and still didn't really know why. This year, they actually did a study on the Tasmane, and their subsistence population that live in South America. And what they found was that the Tasmane actually have the same arterial stiffness as an ultramarathon runner. And so it's identical. It's 6.5, which is very, very, very low. The Tasmane also have the lowest, it's called coronary arterial calcium. So it's a measure of how much calcium is in your arteries, basically. And they also have the lowest coronary arterial calcium ever recorded in a population. It was 0 at 40, even going up to 50, it was like 8, but they have virtually no heart disease. And I think there are 2 reasons for that. On average, they take about 18,000 steps per day. They live in this kind of hilly jungle area. So all day, every day for years, they're just going through the jungle. They're walking. Their diet is very, very low in saturated fat. They get a lot of fiber. And in this paper, it was the first time that scientists had really kind of attributed a reason to why they might be that supernova phenotype. And those are the things that they mentioned. So I think it's really interesting that you can get very low coronary artery scores, have basically the arterial stiffness of an ultramarathoner, and have virtually no heart disease. And I think it just comes from a lot of movement every single day. You also see very high VO2 maxes in the Tismane. And so I believe in a direct measurement, it was in the high 60s, which is incredible.
It's very high.
Yeah, it's very, very high. They are a little bit shorter stature. To be fair, there were some issues with this study. They didn't do a VO2 max test to exhaustion. So it has a little bit of error. It's probably between 8 and 13% error possibility. But they did it on over 100 people. So that median is probably not too far off. In that high 60s, and even if you shave off 10%, that's still incredible.
Super fascinating, and we're going to pull on all those threads here in this conversation. But I want to add in some context for our audience who's listening that the reason that you even got excited about walking in the first place was none of those things. It was actually to support fat burning and fat loss. At the age of 47, you ran into a friend at a party or something like that. And this friend literally came up to you and said, "Hey, do you want to get in the best shape of your life?" And you said, "Absolutely, yes." And you went on a journey together. They became a coach for you and helped you dial in your program, resistance training, increasing your protein, and a bunch of other things. And one of those things were, your friend mentioned to you, try to shoot for a certain amount of steps every day because it will help with the fat loss part of your program. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's accurate. I went to my friend's birthday party. He was turning 57 at the time. And he's just like been someone I really look up to for health because he's about 10 years older than me. And he's in such incredible shape. So I've always admired him. And my friend John came up and literally asked that question, "Hey, do you want to get ripped?" In his words. I'm like, "Yes, I absolutely do." So he became my coach. And one of the things that he recommended was steps. He had initially suggested 12,000 steps. And I just asked him, would there be benefit to me getting around 17? Would that be better? And he's like, "Oh, yes, absolutely. If you could get 17,000 steps, that would be a lot better for you." So I basically just did everything that he said. He helped me get my diet dialed in, got into a slight caloric deficit, and then just started walking 17,000 steps every day. And I was really blown away at the results. Because what I noticed was, the combination of those two, I could literally see my body composition, changing by the day. And there's one thing that is exceptional about walking is that, if you go for, let's say an 8 or 9 mile run, you may not be able to do that every day. But, if you're walking 17,000 steps, that has, pretty low fatigue. And that is something that you can do every day. So I was just noticing day by day changes in my body. I remember, I think like 11 days in, the abs were starting to poke through. And I was like, this is just absolutely incredible. But I also couldn't believe how great it made me feel. Just being out there in the sun, getting all these steps in. I would walk by people's houses because I took a lot of the walks in the evening, after dinner. And in Seattle, the summers are just absolutely beautiful. The weather in the evenings is perfect. And I remember looking inside people's houses, and I would see them, in there watching TV. And I just remember thinking to myself, I'm so glad that I'm out here doing this. I would much rather be out here in this beautiful weather, walking, changing my body than being inside watching TV.
You talked about some of the results. I know you obviously were doing a few things at the same time. You were increasing your protein, your resistance training. You're probably getting a little bit stricter about your diet and what you're consuming. I don't know if at that point in time you had started increasing your fiber, but what were some of the results that you feel you can attribute, at least in some part, to the massive increase in steps that you started taking?
Yeah, so it was a substantial reduction in body fat. I think I started, around 15, 16%, and ended under 10. Really incredible. Just to basically be able to see abs and the aesthetic changes that it created. But also on the other side, my blood work looked so much better. I think that my natural testosterone was around 840, which at my age at that time, 47, is exceptional. My lipids had looked better than they'd ever looked. And then I also got a DEXA to measure visceral fat, and that was the lowest it had ever been. It was, I think, 342 grams at the time, which is very, very good. And visceral fat is kind of the fat around our organs, and it can be a big contributor to inflammation, hepatic insulin resistance, and all sorts of other things. So yeah, I was seeing the aesthetic changes. I was seeing the quantitative changes on my blood work, and I was just kind of sold. It was just something that I knew that I wanted to stick with.
So just for clarification purposes, if you had to rank these benefits that you got from the list of things you were doing, would you say number one would be, you're in a slight caloric deficit?
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to be able to lose weight without that, right? Aspect. So you're in a slight caloric deficit. And then what would you rank as the next items that played a role? Obviously, the beauty about walking that I've really learned from you is that it plays into everything that you're doing. All these things build off of each other, increasing your fiber, increasing your walking, doing resistance training. It's not like they live in isolation. They kind of work together. But if you had to rank them, what would you put after being on a deficit calorically? What was the next thing for you?
I would say it's kind of hard to rank 2 and 3, but definitely protein intake and resistance training. Having enough protein, especially when you're in a deficit, is going to be really important for muscle mass preservation. Because if you don't have enough amino acids, your body's going to go start breaking down muscle to generate those amino acids. So protein is incredibly important to preserve that muscle mass, so that when you're losing that weight, it's fat that you're losing and not muscle. And resistance training as well is also absolutely critical for just maintaining that muscle mass. And then third or fourth would be, I think, walking behind that. And it does a lot of things, but one thing that it can do when you're in a deficit is push that deficit, a little further. So, instead of being I think I was at a 300 calorie deficit at the time, if you can burn another 300 to 500 calories just by walking, that's going to push you into deficit even more. And from my experience, it's been a little bit easier to have the deficit come from movement rather than from calories itself. I tried that during my transformation. And one thing that I noticed was that it was a lot harder to have a steeper caloric deficit than to make that deficit a little smaller and then make up for that with movement.
Yeah, it's nice when there's a balance between the both of them. And the other thing that I've seen when I got serious about resistance training and adding in walking when I turned in 40, and then I lost a little bit of it, and I found your content, and I got a little bit more excited and doubled down on walking again. But back when I turned 40, and I thought, okay, I need to stop being a skinny fat Indian and, have my genetics that are not working for me with this modern sort of Western lifestyle. Let me combat some of this. Is that I found that walking made me a lot more adherent to my program, between its impact on mood and the fact that sometimes we just eat because we're bored. And I didn't notice something, which is that when I would get in regularly 10 to 12,000 steps a day, I just wasn't feeling that urge to want to eat or snack on things that, weren't as beneficial for what I was trying to put inside of my diet. I don't know how to explain that mechanism, but it just made me more adherent and less wanting to dip into some of the behaviors that I was trying to step away from.
Yeah, I noticed the same thing. Yeah, and I'm not sure exactly why that happens, but I noticed a few times if I was hungry and wanting to eat something that I probably shouldn't be eating, if I just went on a walk, it would kind of take that desire away. And I'm not sure exactly why that happens. I know that GLP-1 and PYY can be signaled a little bit through movement. So that may be one reason why I haven't really dug into that. But yeah, I've noticed that as well. And I've noticed a lot of other people say that too.
So I think it was a few years ago when Peter Attia came out with his book on longevity that I saw a podcast that he was doing in the Q&A, and he was addressing the whole 10,000 steps phenomenon that's out there, which largely everybody knows came originally from a pedometer company in Japan and the history around that. But that's still, it's a nice little measure for people to shoot for in the day. When you consider that the average North American is living a borderline sedentary lifestyle, according to the CDC, which is they're around like 4,000 steps. And I think that under 4,000 steps is considered sedentary, is what I've seen based on the data that's out there. But going back to Peter Attia, I remember thinking at the time, like, wow, I'm getting in all this walking and I'm also resistance training. And I might have taken his words out of context, but he said something to the degree of like, I'm just not convinced about the benefits of walking in this Q&A for 10,000 steps. It wasn't that he was against it, but I think he was talking very similarly to a clip that I sent to you from a woman that was on my podcast, Dr. Vonda Wright, a few weeks prior to me reaching out to you, joining the podcast. I think he was saying, like, if we don't get in the resistance training, then walking is not going to make up for anything else. Then on the flip side, you've had people like Walter Longo and some of those individuals that are more adherent to the Blue Zones approach say, well, look at all these Blue Zones groups that are out there. Look at these modern day hunter-gatherer tribes that are there. They're not, in the gym. They're not doing resistance training. And they're just walking. They're walking in hilly areas. They're just getting a lot of walking on a regular basis. And largely the conclusion that I came to after seeing all of that, and some of your work has helped me with this conclusion, is, hey, resistance training and being strong is so important to aging, especially when it comes to frailty. We don't want to be frail. We don't want to break our hip and end up in a position where we never end up walking again, which happens to about, I think, like 60% of women and a little bit less of a percentage of men above the age of 60, that we dial into the protective benefits of maintaining quality muscle mass. And on top of that, as much as walking as you can get in, and at least shooting to double the sedentary numbers that are out there. If if the average person is getting 4,000, if you can at least get in 8,000 to start off, you're going to get all the beneficial components that come into glucose, lipid clearance, which I didn't know about it as much until I started following your work, the mood benefits. And if I throw in a little layer and a little sprinkle of, the world of Huberman on there, the benefits of sunlight throughout the day and its ability to modulate your health and your mood. So why not have both of them if you can at least come up with a strategy of how to regularly get in walking that doesn't make you feel discouraged or stressed or deprioritize, strength training in your life. So that's how I've come to sort of wrap all these things together. What do you think about that? Would you add any layers to that? Would you take away any layers to that?
So first of all, I love Peter, I love his work. I loved that book that he created. The Outlive was fantastic. I think one area where I would, slightly disagree with him is I do think that we have incredible evidence on the benefits of walking. There's a study, and I can send this to you after we're done so you can link it in the show notes. But it was, a large epidemiological study that looked at all-cause mortality and steps to make a correlation between them. Moving from 4,000 steps to 8,000 steps a day was associated with a 51% reduction in all-cause mortality. When you move that up to 12,000, from 8,000 to 12,000, that was a 65% reduction in all-cause mortality. So the other way that you can look at it is on the studies of being sedentary. And if you moved, if you moved from the top quadrant to the next quadrant down, and so the people in the top quadrant for just being sedentary, you could think of them as like getting almost no movement. The bottom quadrant was going to be the most movement. But moving from that top quadrant to the next quadrant down was associated with a 49% reduction in risk. And that is just like doing any movement. So I think that we can see it in the walking data. I think that we can see the inverse in the sedentary data. And then we do have all of the results from these subsistence populations and the blue zones where people predominantly do walking. The Hadza are really interesting to me because as the women age in that society, they don't see a lot of muscle loss. Their walking speed doesn't go down. Their bone density stays healthy. And I think the Hadza women are getting, I think, between 12 and 14,000 steps per day. But they're also doing a lot of gardening. They dig for tubers. So they're just kind of moving all the time. They're not doing strict resistance training, but they can still, avoid, a lot of bone loss just from all of this low level movement. That being said, I still think resistance training is incredibly important. Especially for women as we age.
Well said. You talked about lipid clearance and you kind of a little bit touched on that, but fat oxidation. Can you just explain that a little bit to our audience and its connection to walking?
When we're doing kind of low level exercise, we're going to burn a little bit more fat and we're oxidize a little bit more fat than we are glucose. As that intensity increases, you're going to start burning more glucose than you are fat. And this is just fat in our bloodstream. It's not usually the fat that's like subcutaneous or anything. But I think that can be incredibly important. So, if you go all the way on the other end to something really intense, like high intensity interval training, you're going to be burning almost all glucose on that side. So what can be great about walking is the fact that you're oxidizing mostly fat. And another thing about zone 2 is that I know that Peter really advocates for. I'm a really big fan too. But in that zone 2 is going to be where you're going to be burning a little bit more fat than you are glucose.
So, folks are listening today and they're saying, great, another thing that I'm adding on my list and that I'm trying to figure out how to get in. And you've tackled this pretty head on. And you had a pretty viral tweet that was talking about how regular movement, even a few minutes squeezed in every hour or 90 minutes, adds up when we're super consistent about that. Can you walk us through that approach?
Yeah, absolutely. So it can be very difficult to get, even 10,000 steps can seem like a really big challenge, moving from 4,000 to 10,000. But I think it's a lot more manageable if you just think about like how to break it up. And so in that post that you were referring to, I was kind of going through the math of what it would be like if you just tried to move for 5 minutes every hour or 10 minutes every hour. And if you make the conscious effort of even just walking for 5 minutes per waking hour, that would be 8,000 steps, on top of the other steps that you're taking through the day. So that would probably put most people at around 10 to 12,000 just by moving 5 minutes of every hour. If you move up to 10, that's, I think that was 12,000 steps or thereabouts. So it can be difficult to think about, moving, taking a 2-hour walk per day. I don't think really anyone has, much time for that. But, that's not typically what we see in the subsistence populations. They're not going out for a 2-hour intentional walk. It's very much broken up through the day and just kind of constant movement. So a couple things that I've done in my life that have really helped is I have a standing desk. That's where I am now. I've got a walking pad underneath. And so when I'm working or, in meetings, I'll just turn that on. That has made a really big difference. I also have a walking pad in my living room. So, for watching a movie or anything like that, uh, I'll, I'll be on there sometimes. But it's just kind of incredible. If you just make some small changes in your habits, the results can be pretty big. Like if you just commit to taking a 10 to 15-minute walk after meals, maybe a 20-minute walk when you get up, a 20-minute walk before you go to bed, and that's going to put you right in the range of where you need to be. So, yeah, I think looking at it as this big number can be very intimidating, but with some very small changes in your habits, it can be manageable, I think, for most people.
Any do's and don'ts for the walking pad? I've gone through a few, some I've liked, some I've thought, oh, this is a little too bulky. You have a favorite brand that's out there for walking pads?
I think it was called Sparax. It was, kind of one of these off brands off of Amazon that I've been buying. I really like that. But I do think it's important to look for one that's going to have enough stride length for you. Because if it's too short for you, you might feel like you're going to fall off all the time. So I think that's pretty important. And they're relatively inexpensive. I think you can sometimes find them on sale for around $100. And then another thing would just be, it can be a lot easier to store it if you're able to move it. And so finding one that's going to be light enough for you to tip on its side by your desk or something like that.
Yeah, they've definitely gotten less bulkier and more inexpensive, which I really appreciate. I got one for my wife and I realized a few years ago, this was during COVID, it was very difficult for her to walk while she was doing work. Like she hadn't, some people like it, some people have a harder time doing it. So I thought, okay, let's get a walking pad that we keep in our living room, at least, that maybe if we're watching something. But it was so bulky that it was hard for her to move or reposition, that she just wasn't using it as much. And I wasn't using it as much because I do like it in different areas. So then finally she ended up getting one that was a lot thinner. Again, no affiliation. I don't even know what the brand name is. And that made a huge difference, that you can kind of move it a little bit here and there, unless if you already have, two, one in your office and one in your living room. So walking pads definitely can be a game changer. Talking about tweets, you shared this tweet from a gentleman named Victor showing an extreme version of how somebody could log, I think it was 223 miles in a month, which is on par of somebody who is training for a marathon, by simply, massively increasing their steps. Can you describe that a little bit?
Yeah, I was really fascinated. I'm a big fan of this guy named Victor. He's a bodybuilder, but what I love about him is how disciplined he is, and everything that he does is just so inspiring. But one thing that he does is he gets about 15,000 steps every day, day in and day out. And he shared his walking stats for the year, and he was just like a machine, 15,000 steps every day. I'd also seen the mileage that was logged by a runner on X, and how much mileage he was doing. And I was noticing that they were identical. And so he was in the mode of preparing for a marathon. And so his mileage was probably a little higher than it would have been otherwise. But it was just incredible to me that you could log, roughly the same mileage as somebody training for a marathon just by walking that much every day. And it's not exactly the same, because there are going to be some different adaptations. He's probably running 6-minute miles at least. The marathon runner, he's a very, very good runner. So that's going to result in some slightly different adaptations than just walking alone. The two parts of it are going to be what's called central. And so this is going to be, changes to the amount of blood that you can pump through your heart, things like that. You could think of it as like more of the power adaptations. So running will absolutely result in more of those. But there are also there's the other side, which is more peripheral adaptations. And so this is where you get what's called PGC1 activation. So this one of the things that it controls is mitochondrial biogenesis. And so it's going to tell your body to build more mitochondria. It's going to increase nitric oxide in your blood vessels, which is going to make them in your arteries a little bit more supple. And so all those peripheral changes, those are what you're getting in walking. And I suspect that those peripheral changes are probably a little bit more important to longevity than the central changes. And that's just looking at what we're seeing in these subsistence populations where they have these supple arteries that are the same as ultramarathon runners, where they have very low incidence rates of chronic disease. So, Victor in his 15,000 steps per day, he was getting, almost all peripheral changes. And, I would love to see that guy's blood work because I bet it's absolutely fantastic.
Picking off of that, one of the things that got you, quote unquote, in trouble with some of the marathon runners that are out there is that you were making the argument that look at all this mileage you're racking up, as you mentioned. If you're walking, consistently getting in 10, 12, 15,000 steps every single day, and then look at some of this data that's coming out of these subsistence populations that are there. And the argument that I think that got you in trouble with some of these communities and earned you an interesting title, which we'll talk about in a second, is that you were saying that you can develop elite level VO2 max, which is one measure of how well, our longevity is heading. If it's high or if it's really low, it's a greater predictor of mortality from the literature that's out there. And your argument was you can develop an elite level VO2 max simply by being super consistent with high volume walking. Is that right? And then tell us what happened after that.
Yeah, I think what really got me in trouble was using the word elite. And because I think elite to that group that was being critical of what I said fairly was that, they're coming from a training standpoint. And so when they're thinking about an elite VO2 max, they're thinking about somebody, who has a VO2 max in the 70s. So very, very, very high.
Which would be, just for context for our audience, if they're not familiar, that'd be like Olympic level, right?
Yes. Olympic level. Think about like a Olympic cross country skier or something like that. So when they heard elite, that's what they were thinking, like, Olympic level VO2 max. Where I was coming from was, elite from a longevity perspective. There is a pretty big drop off in terms of longevity benefits at some point in time. So if you move to the top quartile, that's basically associated with about 97% of the explanation in mortality. Moving, I think, to that top 2% only got you one absolute percentage point more. Getting it much higher doesn't seem to have too much benefit. So that's where I was coming from elite VO2 max. I probably should have, retrospect, specified that. I think it would have avoided a lot of the arguments, but it did, result in a great new title for me. So I have that going for me.
Yeah. And that title, for those that are following along, that title is Walking Grifter. And that also, I think you embrace this, which I love. I love that you don't take yourself too seriously on that side. You engage in the dialogue. So they called you a walking grifter. If those don't know, if you're listening and you're like, what is a grifter? It's somebody trying to sell something or marketing something or sign you up for something. So the joke is that you're trying to sign up all these affiliates because you're convincing everybody to walk more. And then you said people even accused you of being part of Big Walking, that you're being sponsored by Big Walking, which I love that. Those are all great things. We should totally get you the domain name Big Walking and get some merch out there so you can actually.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Have some stuff out there. It's a funny story, and but the beauty that came out of that, and I think the central message that's there for people is that there's going to be a lot of things in your life, at least from the literature that's out there, if you significantly can increase your walking, and then especially as you age. I have some people that are part of my core demographic in my audience that are, listening to this episode, and they're in their 60s, they're in their 70s, and they're thinking about things that they can regularly do for their health. And they might not have the level of agility or movement or other aspects that they might have had previously in their 40s and 50s. So knowing that there's still so much value that can come from doubling down on your walking is an important reminder for people who feel like, man, I can't do sprints yet. I'm not doing as much resistance training volume. I want to get there. What are the other things that I can do that can still take me in the right direction as I continue to improve my health? So I think that's an important reminder for people. And obviously one of the central reasons that I wanted to have you back on that I want to have you on the podcast. I want to go into something that you mentioned earlier, which was the vascular stiffening. Are you familiar with what are the best measures that we have available to us today? If somebody wanted to get a snapshot of where they're, where they stood in terms of their vascular stiffening, what's available for them today that you know of that's out there? Or what are the best proxies to get a sense of where your vascular stiffening is if you wanted to measure it?
Yeah, there is a measurement, and it's called CF. Gosh, I might get this wrong, but it's basically a pulse wave measurement, and so you can go get it measured. It's what they're using in all of these different tests, but it will measure, how stiff your arteries are, and it is available.
So it's called pulse. It's a pulse wave technology, you were saying?
Pulse wave, yeah.
Okay, I'm familiar a little bit with. It's kind of related to it. There's something called an endopat test. Have you heard of this?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so an endopat test is a device that looks at your endothelial health, and it's basically an arterial tone test. So it's a non-invasive diagnostic where you basically put this almost looks like a pulse ox meter on your finger. It has to be run by a clinician or a group that's there. The brand name is called Endopat, and if you go on their website, they have a bunch of different, they have a map and a directory where you can find out like who runs this test, and it gives you back this report in terms of how stiff or functional your arterial lining is. I had it done. There's a cardiologist that I work with that's in St. Louis who I've talked about before. He's been on my podcast. His name is Michael Twyman. It's one test that he uses in addition to a bunch of other tests to look at your overall heart and arterial health that's there. So I don't have any affiliation with the company, but yeah, it's called Endopat, ENDOPAT, and there's a bunch of different people. I think that the test is somewhere sub $300, so it is a little bit of an expense that's there. But if people were curious, that's one thing that they could check out. And yeah, maybe after the episode, you could tell me a little bit about what you were chatting about, and we can include that as a link or a resource that people could ask.
Yeah, I have it right here. So it's called carotid femoral pulse wave velocity. Is the measurement, or CFPWV. I think that's the gold standard, but this Endopat sounds incredible.
And for that test that you mentioned, do you know, like, can people get that direct to consumer? Do you have to have your clinician order it? Like, how does that, is it only in research settings?
That's what I don't know.
Okay.
We see it, a lot in research settings, but I'm not sure if that's something that, is standard. You can just go in and measure.
Walking plays right hand in hand into all these changes that you were making, right? Resistance training, increasing protein, the protein conversation. So many people have had that conversation. We've had that conversation here on our podcast many times. And then also along with it, there was this doubling down on fiber. And you mentioned this earlier as well, and I think it's worth touching on, is that, again, you were looking at a lot of these subsistence populations, like the Chimane, like the Hadza, and you were seeing that one of the ideas of why they also seem to maybe not have the level of cardiovascular disease that we deal with in the Western world, which is, again, the number one killer around the world, is because of, in addition to their activity levels, it's their fiber levels. And you've been so bold to say that you shoot for a target of 70 to 80 grams of fiber in a day. So did I get that right? And anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, you got that exactly right. So we do see a lot of fiber variation in subsistence populations. On one end, you have the Chimane who are getting, sometimes upwards of 100 grams per day. They have a diet that's about 70% carbs. A lot of that is tubers. And so they're going to be getting a lot of fermentable fiber from that. On the other end of the spectrum, you have people like the Maasai, and they get very, very little fiber intake. And so they both have exceptional outcomes. But I think that if you look at the differences between, something like the Hadza or Chimane who get more fiber intake versus, the Maasai that don't, you just see a little less cardiovascular disease in those who get a little bit more fiber and have lower saturated fat, lower CAC, less fatty streaks. But yeah, I think fiber is incredible. We have this tendency to think about, fiber just kind of as roughage. And that is going to be the insoluble fiber, typically where it doesn't go in, it doesn't ferment. But the fermentable fiber, what that's going to do is it's going to ferment it down into these short chain fatty acids. And that's the important part. The important part is having enough of those. And if you have enough short chain fatty acids, you're going to get really good signaling for HDAC inhibition. And so HDAC, one of the things that it controls is your tight junctions in your gut lining. And so if you inhibit HDAC, your junctions in your gut lining are going to become more tight. If you do not have a lot of fiber, it's going to go in the opposite direction and your gut junctions will start loosening. One of the reasons why I think that is because you're still going to need butyrate. And what happens in settings of low fiber is the butyrate comes from a mucin from your gut lining that's then fermented instead of getting that from fiber. So HDAC inhibition is one. Another thing that it will do is it will signal what's called FFAR2 and FFAR3. And what those do indirectly is they will stimulate the production of endogenous GLP-1 to help with appetite control, and then also PYY, which is also for appetite control. So it can also have impacts on insulin sensitivity. So if we don't have a lot of fiber in our diet and we're primarily at that point in time, your microbiome will switch over to fermenting mostly amino acids. When that happens, you can have resulting things like it's called IMP. So that can be something that's produced that has been associated with atherosclerosis and then also insulin resistance. You can get byproducts like ammonia or another one called P-crustol. So in a state of adequate and higher fiber, you're not going to see those toxic metabolites. You're going to have HDAC inhibited so that your gut junctions are tight. You're going to see more signaling on the GLP-1 and PYY side. And then also your immunity won't be as overactive. So when you kind of remove fiber, I think one of the reasons why this may be the case is that it's kind of signaling to your body that there's not an abundance of food out there. And so it kind of needs to go into a period where it's preparing for, just less food availability. That's kind of my personal opinion. And when that happens, it needs to upregulate our immune systems. It's going to upregulate insulin resistance because you don't know when you're going to get glucose next, increase our hunger. So that's kind of like why I think it's happening. But I do believe it's meant to be kind of a temporary state, more to get us through like a winter where there's not as much plant material than the default state, which it is for most people.
So walk us through, how do you get your 70 to 80 grams of fiber? Obviously, we're talking about you. This is your N of one
Yes.
experience, but based on all the literature you've seen out there and the different types of fibers you want to try to incorporate in your diet, how are you getting that in typically?
I think that you can do pretty well if you include two to three servings of vegetables per day. But then also looking to incorporate things, what's called like RS2 or RS3. So these are resistant starches. And what's great about them is they will resist digestion. So they will make their way into your colon undigested. And this is great because then your microbiome is able to ferment those into the short chain fatty acids. And so you can get resistant starches from things like green bananas are really high in them if you can tolerate them. Heated and cooled potatoes or rice is another good one. So you heat them and then you cool them and they become RS3 in that case. Or heated and cooled beans is another version of that. So I think that if you can try to get at least a serving or two of those per day, you'd be in pretty good shape. There are also things that you can do like potato starch, putting like a tablespoon of potato starch in your diet, or green banana flour is another one that's really good. So that can be great. However, you have a really big disclaimer here, and that is it's important to go very, very slowly and really observe any symptoms that you're having. Because if you're not used to having a lot of fiber in your diet, your microbiome may not be ready for it. And so you could get like some gas, some bloating. So if you're noticing those, you probably want to back off a bit and just go a little slower.
Yeah, that's great advice. Connecting those two things together with something that I came across recently, which was an episode that Andrew Huberman was doing on the insulin resistant subtypes. I think you tweeted about it as well too.
Yeah.
The background that I come from is I'm Indian. I was born in Kenya. Interestingly enough, one of the coolest trips that I went on was I went and stayed at this camp in northern Kenya, where we were spending all this time over the course of a week with the Samburu, which are cousins of the Maasai, and getting a chance to see how they live, going on walks with them, seeing the area,
Wow, that's so cool.
meeting their families. It was one of the coolest experiences that I ever had, like fetching water with them. Yeah, just like living, a daily life with them. If anybody actually wants to check it out, the camp is really cool. I'll put the link in the show notes. But my background is Indian, and in North America, the Indian subtype population, so South Asian, so Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Sri Lankan, they have the highest cardiovascular risk of any ethnic minority that's there. And, cardiovascular disease, even in India, is a big, big problem. Not just, the things that we typically deal with in the West, but there too, it seems that air pollution is a big driver of poor endothelial health. I think of the top 50 most polluted cities in the world, India has like 10 of them that are there. So it's a very unfortunate situation. Nonetheless, coming back to the South Asian population in the United States, from the time that I was young and always got blood work, I had always seen that, my lipids were really, really off, that my LDL was high. We weren't really looking at ApoB back then. That's a more of a new phenomenon. And I noticed that my triglycerides would always jump up, even once I started watching my diet, but then I'd add in some extra carbohydrates as I started training inside of the gym. And my trainer would say, hey, let's try to have you have like maybe 250 grams of carbs, as we're really sort of getting you in the zone of increasing muscle mass, replenishing glycogen. And I would get blood work after these periods of doing these N of 1 experiments, just like you're doing. And I would see my triglycerides had shot up all of a sudden. And the more and more that I learned through my cardiologist is that it seems that a lot of people from this region have a combination of a few different genes that they're dealing with that make them more likely to be, in my instance, I'm a hyper reabsorber. So there's hyper producers that are out there that have familial hypercholesterolemia. I'm in the category of being somebody that's a hyper reabsorber. So when I have, some of these fats through my food, and if they're excessive, my body just tends to recirculate a lot of those lipids that are there. And that's why clearance is going to be, so important for somebody like me. In addition to that, there was a few other genes that I had. I did a test. I wrote about it in my newsletter. I can link to it in the show notes if people are curious about it. Where I also was somebody who, for whatever reason, triglycerides also hang around a lot longer in my bloodstream as well too. So I'm very sensitive to having a lot more carbohydrates in my diet as well. So now I sort of cycle on and off. I'll have a higher carbohydrate load on days that I train, and then I'll kind of bring it down to a more maintenance mode that was there. The point of the reason that I'm bringing this up, talking to a lot of different South Asians who are living here in the West, one of the things that they see is, again, they tend to be programmers, they tend to be doctors, they tend to be these high, Zoom professionals that are out there. That lifestyle comes with being a lot more sedentary. You're not moving as much. And then on top of that, when you audit the traditional sort of Indian and then American diet that they're having, they're not really having a lot of fiber in their diet as well too. So it's definitely feels to me that it's one of the reasons that this group of individuals is having such a hard time with lipid clearance and having such poor blood results that are increasing their cardiovascular risk. So that was a little, just me sharing some context for my audience, because I've talked about this before and the journey that I've been on, which is increasing my fiber and making sure I get activity. And then in my instance, because I am a hyper reabsorber, I chose to go on ezetimibe after looking at a lot of the different data and working with my cardiologist. Again, not medical advice, and I'm not a doctor. But the combination of those three things that I did made a significant difference in my blood work. And also I just felt better as well too. So I'd love you to also make the connection of what do you know about, in addition to fiber being great for gut health and protecting that mucus lining and making sure that our body doesn't eat our own mucus lining because there's not enough fiber and short chain fatty acids that we're providing it with. What do you know about fiber and cardiovascular disease?
That's another thing that it can help with, is just cholesterol clearance. Certain types of fiber can really help clear cholesterol. So that could be one thing. Going back, I do think genetics are so important, and it's so great that you found those genes that you have, because I have some clearance genes myself, actually very similar. But if you're able to find these and kind of find the genetic reason why, it can be a real game changer in being able to change your own health, to understand what those are and to be able to modify your lifestyle around them. One other thing that I think could also be really interesting to think about too is, I think the South Asian diet sometimes can be a little lower in choline. Choline is one of the most important things that we can have for cholesterol. And the reason why is it is used as a structural element, so phosphatidylcholine, in packaging VLDL. And so if you do not have choline, your VLDL is going to be exported with very triglyceride rich. And then ultimately this will result in more what's called SD-LDL, or small dense LDL, which is very atherogenic. So yeah, it just made me wonder, could that also be one of the problems, could be possibly low choline as well.
Yeah, that's a great insight. I'm going to share just really quickly because it could be interesting for our audience here. I wrote about it before, and then I want to hear about how you've gone through the journey as well too. So just sharing my screen here for those that are watching on YouTube. We'll link to it in the show notes as well. But here are a few of the ones. So the tests that I did, again, no affiliation. My cardiologist ordered it. I think a clinician has to order it. It's called GB Insights. It's a genetic test that comes back and helps you understand the specific genetic SNPs, genes, I don't know if the proper terminology is, that are related to cardiovascular. They have a few different ones that are there. So one that showed up for me was ApoE E4, which is a strong risk factor for high LDL cholesterol and higher lipoprotein A, which I do. I've always had a higher lipoprotein A. This next one here is CDKN2B AS1, which is strongly associated with increased coronary artery disease and heart attack risk through its effect on blood vessel wall health. Again, these are your genetics, but obviously your lifestyle plays a huge factor into these. A couple others here. I'm not going to mention, all of them. They're quite technical, but another one for modestly raising coronary artery risk disease. Another one for likely increasing triglyceride levels. This is the one that I mentioned to you when I have, originally my trainer was saying, look, I know you don't respond to carbohydrates well, but if it helps you increase your muscle mass is going to help you clear other things like glucose, which is going to end up helping your heart health. So let's try this experiment. Ultimately, I ended up landing on only having a higher a higher carb load on the days that I train and kind of bringing it down to more of a maintenance load, which is for me no more than about 110 grams on the days that I'm not training. And then a couple here that are contributing to cholesterol metabolism and impacting me there. Again, you can find the details inside of the show notes, and I wrote a little bit more about it. And it's obviously great that tests like this, exist in the first place. When you were going down that journey, Greg, yourself, and you were looking at your genes and how they played into it, how did you do it? Are you doing like 23andMe and dumping it into like some sort of program or reader, or was there some sort of other test that you used?
Yeah, I did 23andMe, downloaded the raw file, and I both analyzed that just manually, but there are also some software that you can use. It's free. It's called Genetic Genie. So that can help you find certain things. But one of the things that I found as well was also ApoE4. And I was so glad that I did. I found it, I think, about 9 years ago, and also have high LPA as a result. But some of these can be so important to find because they can explain things that would otherwise be difficult to explain, like why you have high LPA or higher cholesterol. So really important to get done. So there are a lot of options for genetic testing. You can have your full genome sequenced, which is going to be on the more expensive side, or you can you do something a little more cheaply, which would be kind of get the direct consumer, something like Ancestry.com, download the raw data. They're not going to be quite the same in terms of the information that they tell you, but even starting with one of those less expensive tests, I think they're under $100 now, can give you a lot of information that you otherwise wouldn't have.
That's great. Yeah. Anything else based on your genes that you've seen, again, in your sort of N-of-1 experiments that you doubled down on in your health, or you saw, what, I'm more genetically likely to have this happen, so I really need to focus on this nutrient or this other aspect? Any other insights from your genetics?
Yeah, probably one of the bigger ones was discovering these methylation genetics that I had. So I have what's called MTRR. And so with that, you kind of have trouble recycling B vitamins. You can have some issues with folate as well. There's another one that's a little bit related called MTHFR, which can be very popular or very prevalent in the population. I think it's like 40% of the population has it. But those are probably the biggest ones, was understanding my methylation genetics and then optimizing to make sure that I got the right B vitamins and the right quantities. That made a huge difference in how I felt. I also have, unfortunately, another one that's called COMT, so COMT, and this can impact how fast or slow you can clear things like catecholamines. And so I'm a slow COMT, which means that I kind of, clear things like adrenaline a little bit slower. So that was another one because I'd always wondered why I didn't feel well after high periods of stress or really intense exercise. And I think that gene probably explains it to a degree. So yeah, you can go really deep down a rabbit hole and find all sorts of things. But probably the two most important, in my opinion, are your lipid genetics to make sure that you understand those and anything that you need to do differently. And then I think number two would be your methylation genetics. And as mentioned earlier, genetic genie, that's a really easy way to just take that raw text file that you get from these direct to consumer companies. You can upload it and it will tell you all of your methylation genetics and what you might need to do differently. So that can
Yeah.
be a really useful resource.
Yeah. My wife has some of those methylation genes, and I know for her doctors have her on her, methylated versions of certain, vitamins, and a few other tweaks. So in terms of seeing those things for you, what were some of the actions that you took in your life? Like, let's say the methylated genes or this you called it COMT?
COMT, yeah.
COMT? Anything that you changed or any things you've added in?
Yeah. So I think the first for MTRR was just making sure that I got the right dosage and the right kind of vitamins. So I started taking a methylated B12, and it took me a while to get the dose right. Then also methylfolate was a really important one for me. So, and then dialing in the dosage for that too, that resulted in a really big change. It took some testing to really kind of nail the dosage to where I felt the best, but that made a really big difference, not only just how I feel day to day, but also in my blood work as well. I had higher homocysteine, it brought that down. So yeah, all in all, my blood work looked a lot better.
We'll have some of those links for that in the show notes if anybody wants to check out Genetic Genie and some of the other ones you mentioned. Thanks for that. All right, Greg, as we're winding down here, we got to touch on one nutrient that you've been super hyped about, which maybe a lot of people are not giving as much love to, and they're not even sure why they should be giving as much love to. And that's the topic of potassium. And you're shooting for 6 to 7 grams of potassium a day. So give us the why, and then we'll talk about the how. Why are you so excited about potassium?
Yeah, I think it's probably one of the better ways to make sure that your endothelial health stays good as you get older. And I think I put protein number one. If you think of that as kind of like the structure, then in my mind, potassium is kind of like the infrastructure, keeping your veins supple, your endothelial supple, making sure that they don't stiffen. But really what it does is you could think of, your cells as almost like a battery in a way. And just like a battery, you basically have a chemical gradient that has a difference in it. And that difference is going to be what's going to create the potential energy. And so potassium is kind of the regulator of the intracellular potential, whereas sodium will be the regulator of the extracellular potential. So outside your cell versus inside your cell. And if you can get those ratios right, then it will have a slightly negative potential and just allow it to function a lot better. I think that one problem in today's society is those ratios are kind of inverted. And so we have a lot more sodium than we do potassium. And this can result in a lot of different things. Hypertension is one of them. But if you can kind of dial in that ratio a little bit better, it's just associated with a lot better outcomes. And I tend to go a little higher in potassium. I think there are some people who argue for a little bit lower potassium, but I think probably between 4 and 7 grams per day, you'd probably be good, assuming you've talked to your doctor and you don't have any, kidney issues, you're not on things like ACE inhibitors or any potassium sparing medication. So before increasing potassium, I think it's important to talk to your doctor, make sure that your kidneys are looking good and you're not on any medications that would impact that.
Now give us the how. How are you getting that much potassium in your day?
I think there's kind of a brain dead way of thinking about it, which is if you just get 2 to 3 servings of fruits or vegetables with each meal, it's going to get you in the range. It's going to get you really, really close. Vegetables are, fruits and vegetables are higher in potassium. And then if you just want to layer on things that are higher in potassium, like have a banana or 2 per day, have an avocado per day. Avocados are very high in potassium, or a little coconut water is also a really good one. Another one of my favorites is beans. So Great Northern beans are really high in potassium. So I think just in general, you don't have to overthink it. If you're just getting enough from fruits and vegetables, you're probably going to get close enough. And then if you have extra banana or avocado per day, it's going to get you close enough without having to put everything in chronometer and really calculate it.
Should we link up your famous chili recipe in the show notes in case anybody wants to make that in the slow cooker?
Yeah. Yeah. The reason why I like that is you hit 2 birds with 1 stone. You get a lot of potassium and then you get a lot of RS3 that we were talking about earlier. So we can link that up. It's really easy to make. I make it in like 10 minutes and it reheats really well.
That's awesome. I've ever since I was a kid, and I don't know if it's through antibiotic exposure, obviously the Indian diet has a lot of lentils, has a lot of beans that are part of it. And always as a kid, I remember feeling like I had more of issues with, gas and distension having beans. I had a lot of antibiotics when I was younger. It was one of those things where, you have a bunch of doctors that are in the family. I know you have a bunch of doctors in your family as well too.
Mm-hmm.
And, kid has a cold or an ear infection. Okay, great. They're just going to give you an antibiotic like it's, candy. And I definitely went through that period as a kid. And I think I suffered for lifelong gastrointestinal issues just from that. Luckily it's largely been great for a long time. And I do well on, ramping up my fiber and everything, but beans and lentils is still one of those things that I can't get around it. I try with enzymes sometimes, I try with other things, but I still don't feel 100% when I have a lot of beans. So at least right now, it's not my primary source of fiber. I go to other areas to make up my fiber load.
I think we all have those foods that just don't agree with us. And I think, once you find those, just remove them.
Yeah, totally.
There are always other sources where you can
There's
get
always
things.
other sources. Greg, anything else that you feel super passionate about right now that in the context of this interview, and especially for my audience and demographic, that you wanted to give some love to, attention, talk about at all?
I think right now I'm most fascinated about really going deeper into the subsistence populations and understanding why they don't get these chronic diseases. So I started writing long form on my Substack. I call it Dark Lab, which sounds ominous, but it's kind of a nod to how science used to be, where it was kind of born in these candlelit rooms with people, on their own drawing diagrams and, figuring out science. So I'm starting to do long form there. Where I'm currently focusing is on obesity and trying to figure out why, when people come off of GLP-1s, why they're regaining weight. And so that's going to be the topic of my first post on there, which should be coming out in the next week.
Oh, that's exciting. I can't wait to sign up, and we'll link it in the show notes so that our audience gets a chance to check it out as well. Greg, talking about where science and medicine came from and these insights that have contributed a lot to our understanding over the years, is that a lot of things came from, yes, clinical yes, double-blind trials are great and everything like that, but so many insights in the history of medicine and health came from these N of 1 experiments that people would do. And I see you're always clear to tell people you're not a doctor. You're not a researcher. You're somebody who is deeply passionate about the literature and trying things, not just to improve your own health, but to also see if these N of 1 experiments can be things that can scale, that other people can get a chance to try. And that's one of the most positive usages of social media. And in this day and age where there's so much divisiveness that's out there, I want to remind people that there's these incredible communities, and you've definitely built one where I see it. I love reading, the replies to your post on X, because people say, wow, this is what I tried and this is what I learned, and you're learning and they're learning. And that's a valuable place, and it's an important thing to highlight. And it's one of the reasons why I really felt like I was so excited to tell my team that I wanted to interview you, because you have a lot of value to offer and share with our audience. So thanks so much for, making the time to come on here. We'll link to your page on X, which is your first name, last name, Greg Mushen. And we'll also link to your Substack as well. Anywhere else you want to send our audience to?
No, I think that's it. And yeah, thank you so much. N=1 experiments can be so valuable to sort of figuring out your personal health.
Especially when they're informed by a lot of the literature that's out there and the research that's out there, which you always point back to. And we'll link to some of the papers that you mentioned below in the show notes. Greg, thanks so much, man. It's been an absolute pleasure to get a chance to talk with you.
Thank you so much. It's also likewise been a pleasure.
YouTube, if you enjoyed what you just saw, keep watching for more great content on how to improve your brain and your life.
If you do not engage in regular movement, regular exercise, regular walking, your heart health fails and you're setting yourself open to all sorts of diseases, metabolic diseases in particular.